Deputy Vice Chancellor, Internationalization, Advancement and Student Affairs, Professor Maluleke, UJ Executive Leadership Group members here present, members of the Diplomatic Corps, our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Pius Adesamni, Professor Peter Vale, respondent, esteemed colleagues, UJ partners, especially AISA, and its CEO here present, Professor Olorunju, and her staff, students, our media partners here present, friends, good evening. My name is Pinky Mekwe. I head up internationalization at the University of Johannesburg here, and I have the honor and pleasure of steering us through most of tonight's program. This is the second in our series of public lectures offered on the International Leadership Platform for 2014, whose umbrella theme is the rise of Africa, or as some people keep saying, Africa Rising, in all its multifacetedness. The ILP is but one expression of UJ's commitment to internationalization through the promotion of scholarly dialogue of international national import. This is in line with UJ's vision of being an international university of choice, anchored in Africa, dynamically shaping the future. Tonight's topic, dwelling as it does on culture and development, and I shall keep my peace around the annoyances part of it, echoes some aspects of the ongoing UJ AISA, and AISA stands for Africa Institute of South Africa, Young Graduates and Scholars Conference that is ongoing this week here at the University of Johannesburg. The theme of the conference is Africa at the Crossroads, the continent's future prospects 50 years after the formation of the OAU and its successor, the AU. I am pleased to note that most of the participants are with us tonight and wish to recognize them. Professor Adesamni, the conference delegates will be interested to note, played a part, he might tell you about it, in the formulation of the African Union's Vision 2063. You may wish to actually take him up on that, because I know, because I have been a part of the discussions down in the Arts Center. You may want to take him up on that. It's been quite interesting listening to the young scholars and the professors that have been working with them, looking at the various dimensions to that. But I speak rather a lot. What I should really do now is to ask you to kindly join me in asking the Deputy Vice Chancellor International to come and formally welcome you and get us started on tonight's proceedings.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Dr. Mekwe, for your wonderful words of opening. And it is my pleasure to speak again. I was there yesterday to welcome you all. I see that the audience is essentially the same as the one I spoke to yesterday. Slightly, she says it's slightly different, but I'm not going to bore you with some of the things I said about the University of Johannesburg. I want to start by recognizing my colleagues here. I see a few esteemed professors in our midst, one of whom will be introduced properly when he responds later, so I won't touch on them. But among us, there are executive deans, Professor Gravet sitting here next to me from the Faculty of Education, Professor Van Lille, should I say Van Lille? from the Faculty of Management here at UJ, and Professor Patrick O'Brien from the Faculty of Law, the Executive Dean there. Professor Ronel Yol. This sounds very Swedish. I've never actually checked with you.
German.
German? Okay. She is the Dean or Acting Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. I recognize all my colleagues who are present here. On behalf of Professor Aaron Rensbeck, I would like to welcome you all to the University of Johannesburg. Seeing that this is an international audience, I'm going to address you in French. Je suis contente à dire bienvenue à l'Université de Johannesburg, la meilleure université d'Afrique du Sud et aussi la meilleure université dans l'Afrique. Est-ce que c'est pas vrai? C'est vrai. C'est vrai. Universities are very interesting entities in that although they are found in a particular locality, what you see is not what you get. The University of Johannesburg is situated here, but in reality, this is a university of Africa, for Africa, in Africa. This is a global university. Dr. Mechwe spoke about it as the international university of choice. And that is indeed what the University of Johannesburg is. I read recently a book about resident aliens, and perhaps universities are resident aliens. They are here, but they don't totally belong here. They belong everywhere. And we see it not only when we welcome people like yourselves coming from so many different countries. We see it in terms of our research reach, the people with whom we collaborate, the students who come here. 3,000 of our students come from all over the world, and we ourselves collaborate with universities from all over the world. We are the only African university that is a member of Universitas 21, a consortium of 28 universities, very research-intensive universities from all over the world. So that we are called the University of Johannesburg is important. It's important because Johannesburg is important. It's important because we are an important university, but it doesn't say everything about us. And that's why we have these connections that I allude to in these opening remarks. Late last year, I traveled with colleagues, the deans, to Lagos, Nigeria. And we visited 3 universities. We traveled in a taxi, minibus. We were living in Lagos, and we traveled to UNILAG, University of Lagos, and also to Ibadan University, as well as Covenant University. I heard that there is someone from Covenant University in our midst. And I thought that traffic in Johannesburg was bad until I saw the traffic there. Even though the traffic was bad, it didn't prevent Dr. Mechwe and Professor Gravet from going shopping. And I mentioned our surgeon, a brief surgeon in Nigeria, to indicate the extent to which this university values collaboration with fellow universities in Africa. And I could talk to you about other expeditions that the leadership of the university have had on the continent. And what makes that significant is that it wasn't only people like me and Dr. Mekwe who were there. Our Vice Chancellor was with us in this trip to Nigeria. He was with us in a trip to Senegal earlier, in a trip to Ghana earlier, in a trip to East Africa earlier. He leads these delegations himself. That's how important Africa is to this university. We intend establishing this university as a Pan-African epicenter for scholarly and intellectual inquiry. That's our intention. And when I see you here, I see you helping us bring to fruition that dream of the University of Johannesburg as the Pan-African epicenter for scholarly, critical scholarly and intellectual inquiry. I have been told not to try and introduce the speakers because someone has been paid already to do that. And the university wouldn't want to waste its money on the person who has been paid to do that. But when I looked at the topic, it made me think of a recent discussion I had on radio, actually. There is a local radio, SAFM, which interviewed me one afternoon. They have this profile program where they interview people who they think are worth interviewing. I think they ran out of people. And they called me to interview me on that day. And one of the questions they asked me was, what are the books, what are the few books that you would say really shook your world and affected your thinking in a deep way? And I mentioned a few books. Some of them included the following: Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism. I said, once I read that book, and if I had not read that book, I probably would not understand the world half as much as I understand it now. And I only understand it half as much still. I also mentioned his other book, Orientalism, because these are books about culture. Culture as what it is and what it is not. Culture as a weapon. Culture as a tool. Sometimes a tool of oppression, as the French often speak about haute culture. Haute culture. What about low culture, if you have high culture? But I also spoke about Chinua Achebe. And I just want to finish by telling a story that I liked reading, which he told about Africa. He tells a story about animals, a fable, in one of his recent books just before he passed on. It's not the British educated Bantu. I think it is his other book just before that, where he tells this story. And he says there was a gathering of animals somewhere in Africa, all sorts of animals coming together because they had a problem to solve. And I'm telling it in my own words now. That problem was, how can we deal with this two-legged animal called human being? Because although this two-legged animal is not as strong as we are, not as big as we are, this animal seems to be winning each and every battle we engage with this animal. So you had the elephants, the lions, the rhinos, all of them moving to one place to assemble to solve this problem. And as they were going to that place, they discovered along the way a family of chickens, cock, hen, chicklings, and they were moving in the wrong direction. They were not going to the meeting place. So they said to them, the meeting is that side. And the chicken family said, we have a very important family issue to resolve. We will join you later. So they went on in the opposite direction. So the animals gathered and they posed questions, they analyzed, they did a SWOT analysis and looked at the human being and said, how can we solve this? Until eventually, several hours later, one little animal raised its hand and said, I would like to propose that we give the chicken to the human as an appeasement so that humans can stop troubling us. And they looked around, and of course the chicken was not there. And that is how we ended up having chicken as domestic animals. That is how we ended up with Kentucky Fried Chicken. And Chinua Achebe said, could this be a story about Africa in that book? Is this what happened to Africa? Is this what is happening to Africa now? I am sure that this and many other profound issues will be touched on in the lecture and have been touched on already in the discussions that we have had. With these few words, I would really want to welcome you to this lecture tonight and ask you to enjoy your stay in this University of Johannesburg, your university, African University, International University. Thank you very much.
Deputy Vice-Chancellor, members of the Executive Leadership Group, esteemed guests, colleagues. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker tonight on the topic of an intriguing topic, culture, development and other annoyances, Professor Pius Adesamni. Currently Professor of English and African Studies at Carleton University in Canada, Carnegie, a diaspora visiting professor. Professor Adesamni holds degrees, the following degrees: a BA from the University of Ireland in Nigeria, a Master's in French from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, as well as a PhD in French Studies from the University of British Columbia. His fields of specialization include the following: post-colonial writing and social media, African and Black diasporic literatures and cultures in English and French, popular culture, street culture in Africa, post-colonial and cultural theory, third world feminist discourses, and African language literature, Yoruba. Professor Adesamni describes himself as having a very eclectic research and writing scope, ranging from recent trends in theoretical approaches to Africa and post-colonial literatures to new political and cultural life worlds in Africa and the Black diaspora. His scholarship overlaps with an active career as an African public intellectual, interested in a broad range of issues such as the role of culture in shaping citizenship, subjectivity, human rights, identity, and the environment in ex-colonial societies affected by globalization and fragile modern states. Lately, he has been reflecting, studying, and writing about the social media revolution in Africa and the post-colonial world. He has been exploring how social media affects the materiality of literature and culture, how it affects our understanding of the text, also the literary text, and inflects old categories of post-colonial knowledge and cultures. With the blogosphere now a universe of interactions, allowing post-colonial literati and culturati to produce new forms of text and meaning, irrespective of location, the question becomes, When, where is home? When, where is diaspora? His forthcoming book, which will be published later this year, is titled Africa's Many Lovers, and it is a collection of some 15 keynote lectures that he has delivered in recent years, exploring these and many other issues. Amongst the honors and nominations bestowed on him are the following. He is a winner of the Penguin Prize for African Writing for non-fiction with a book titled You're Not a Country, Africa. He was nominated in 2012 for the Capital Educators Award. He also received the Erasmus Teaching Award from State Penn University and the Association of Nigerian Authors Poetry Prize in 2001. Amongst the many edited volumes, I'm just going to mention a few just to give an indication of the range of Professor Adesamni's work. He edited, or co-edited with others, Theories and Literatures of Africa, a special issue of Comparative Literature Studies, also third generation Nigerian novel in a special issue of Research in African Literatures, New Nigerian Writing, a special issue of English in Africa, and proceedings of the International Symposium on Youth, Street Culture and Urban Violence in Africa. Some of his recent essays, a select few, I want to mention Ngugi and the Post-Colonial, Arrested Nationalism, Imposed Transnationalism and the African Literature Classroom, with a subtitled A Nigerian Writer's Learning Curve. Also Reshaping Power and the Public Sphere, the Political Voices of African Writers. Professor Adesamni has delivered numerous invited lectures and keynotes, and I just want to draw your attention to three very intriguing titles. Dowry, Managing Africa's Many Lovers, The Hunt for Francophonism, and lastly, I Am Endowed, Hip-Hop, Twittertainment, and Black Musical Internationalism. Professor Adesamni, we look forward to listening to you. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you for that. Wonderful. I was growing taller, and I'm 6'2", so it's not easy to grow a few inches taller when you are 6'2", but it was happening. Thanks. Yeah. Although you ruined my game, though. I'm a professor of English and African Studies. I've been doing English for a while now. People don't always understand that all my degrees are actually in French. BA French, MA French, PhD French. So I was going to intimidate my brother, Professor Maluleke, for dabbling into French. But now it's been done. Okay. I got to take care of some business before I get into my lecture, especially now that I have seen the kind of audience that I'm going to deal with here. Because I had written these, and obviously there are some acknowledgements in the body of I've written it in a conversational style, in a performative style. So in order not to get into trouble, now that I know that there are diplomats, there are all kinds of dignitaries in the audience, so we'll get something out of the way. I did meet some Nigerians when we were drinking. How many of you are here? Very good. Now, the non-Nigerians here, how many of you have read Wole Soyinka's last memoir, You Must Set Forth at Dawn? Yeah, he's very difficult. I'm sure if I asked about Achebe, you would all have read him. The guy doesn't write easy English. So nobody here has read You Must Set Forth at Dawn? You have? Oh, okay. So I'm sure you remember the Iba
have read Joinka.
Yeah, but now you must set forth at dawn. Okay. Because there is the introductory part to that book where he performs some kind of Yoruba ritual of recognition and acknowledgement. Iba. Iba to those who have gone before. Now, because I'm obviously going to leave out so many people out of my protocol and recognitions here, I thought I'd get that out of the way, by doing the Iba thing before I get into my business. But you can all participate. It's a call and response thing. There are. So to all the people I'm going to offend because they were not written into this lecture, the diplomats, the distinguished colleagues, members of the media. To all these people, before I begin, I say, where are the Yoruba guys here? Iba. You have to say it. To all those people, I say, Iba. Okay. So now I'm no longer going to get into trouble if you're not mentioned here. I've cleared the air. I also started this lecture with the only South African salutation that I know. I started with Sawubona. Am I Sawubona? Sawubona. Yeah, but I must go further to establish my South African street credibility because I've been visiting this country since the 90s. And when I first started coming here, it used to be in the streets. It used to be Yebo Gugu, yeah? Yeah, Yebo, right? And there was my countryman on all the billboards. Is he still around? Yes. Yeah. So what? Yeah, Yebo is also part of the greetings, right? So Yebo. Saubona. Okay. Now with that out of the way, you obviously know that my title is Culture, Development, and Other Annoyances. Because it's written again in a conversational style, you'll get to know why I'm annoyed as we go on. Doubtless, when this keynote lecture was advertised and you saw the last keyword, annoyances, in the title, some of you wondered why the conveners of this prestigious lecture decided to settle for an angry Nigerian public intellectual based in Ghana. Some of you may have wondered still, what's biting him? Why is he annoyed? We, South Africans, ought to be the ones screaming out our annoyance, having only been recently eliminated from the early stages of the African Nations Championship by his country, and on our own turf to boot. Fortunately, as I'm not used to gloating about Nigeria's continental football superiority, especially in the presence of our football younger brothers such as Ghanaians, Cameroonians, Egyptians, Congolese, and South Africans, let me quickly assure you that I may be annoyed, all right. It's got absolutely nothing to do with continental rivalries in football. My annoyance, or annoyances, pardon the untidy plural, has also got nothing to do with the fact that I had less than 2 weeks to prepare and write this lecture, tucking it into the grind of other forthcoming keynote lectures in Nigeria and Canada next week. On the contrary, let me reassure the masquerade behind that punitively short notice invitation, Dr. Pinky McWay. Now, she taught me a valuable lesson when she sent me that invitation in a tone that made it clear that she was not going to take no for an answer. She and I, we go a long way. We're way back. You must come, Pinky had written before describing how prestigious this particular lecture platform is. It then dawned on me that if I was being asked to literally hop on the next flight and come down here to Johannesburg for this lecture, Pinky was intimating me with the fierce urgency of the business of Africa. She was telling me that there can be no such thing as a short notice in our collective duty as writers, scholars, and intellectuals to write, think, and envision a future for this continent now. She was telling me that only the permanently ready thinker is worthy of the privilege of getting his or her hands dirty in the vineyards of Africanist knowledge production. Thanks to Pinky and how she ambushed me for this lecture, I now know that the famous motto, "Be prepared," belongs more to those who are called upon to think and write Africa than it belongs to Baden-Powell and his Boy Scouts movement. I am therefore immensely grateful to Dr. Mekwe for the invitation and the epistemological teachable moment that came along with it. I'm grateful to the University of Johannesburg's International Leadership Platform and co-hosts, the Africa Institute of South Africa, for the honor and privilege of being asked to come and share my reflections with you, and alas, my annoyances. Thanks are due to the respondent, Professor Peter Vale, for agreeing to this task, even at the risk of not receiving the lecture until a few hours to delivery. Finally, I want to thank you all, distinguished members of the audience, for taking time out of no time to attend this. By the way, do you use that's Nigerian English? Do you say that in? Do you take time out of no time to do stuff here in South Africa? That's Nigerian English. If you don't do that, start doing it. Start taking time out of no time, to do stuff. Yeah. Seeing you all here reminds me of the ties that bind, of why I love visiting your beautiful country. For I've been here for one and the repeated time since the 1990s. This great country of yours is the site of the last great African anger and annoyance provoked by the fundamental unjustness of man to man. I'm quoting Bob Marley here. You, South Africans, led your country, Africa, and the global community of conscience against this historical unjustness by articulating a struggle powered not just by the bombs of Umkhonto weSizwe, the global resonance of your uprisings and wars against the apartheid machine, the spectacular trajectories of your great anti-apartheid heroes and sheroes, but also, and more importantly, a struggle rooted in, defined and nourished by a deontology of culture. In essence, your worldview, your way of life, your stories, your memories, what you thought of beauty and ugliness, and how you expressed those aesthetic sentiments, how you laughed, how you loved, how and what you ate, how and what you sang, and how you danced, all came together to constitute the soul of your struggle. If there's anything to be learned from the documentary movie Amandla, it is that you did not just fight apartheid to a standstill. You danced and sang that tragedy to its ignominious end. And in so doing, you taught the rest of us, your admirers around the world, that unfathomable zone of potential and becoming that we commonly refer to as a people's future cannot be envisaged or envisioned outside of their culture, outside of who they are, understood in the broadest, evolving, and most dynamic sense possible. Precisely because your future as a rainbow nation was secured at the price of a long-drawn struggle nurtured by your culture, by who you are. Precisely because yours was the last great continental affirmation of the significance of culture, among other things, to the emergence and subsequent shape of a purposed future, you are auspiciously positioned to understand the dilemmas and the discontents framing current discussions of the role of culture in shaping the future of a continent whose friends and enemies agrees on the cusp of yet another historical moment. Having now shaken off the last yoke of colonial domination in 1994, the argument goes roughly: Africa must quit the path of blaming outsiders for her numerous challenges and begin to start being responsible for her present and future. The morphology of this future and what exactly it would take to get us there is where the tough cut lies. Often, we get mixed signals from friends and foes alike. After 1994 and at the beginning of the new millennium in the year 2000, The Economist, for instance, ushered Africa into the 21st century with the now infamous cover title, Africa, the Hopeless Continent. How many of you remember that title? Yeah, okay, thanks. A little over a decade later, this mouthpiece of Western capitalist paternalism changed its tune and declared Africa a hopeful continent. A second cover. This proclamation came in the context of a world suddenly gone giddy, or gone gaga if you like, about the prospects of the African continent. The international capital and finance community, the development community, the global NGO and activist community, world governance bodies and their continental appendages in Africa, the institutional and disciplinary world of the social sciences began to crowd the global space of discourse with dizzying statistics and data bearing narratives of growth and sustainable development, of GDP and capital flow, of governance and democracy. You know all the keywords and the fact. I mean, they're so out there that you shouldn't be surprised that even somebody like me in literature will be throwing them out like I was some African Development Bank executive director. Botswana and Ghana were placed in showrooms as continental showcases of this phenomenon. But I spoke earlier on of mixed messages. Let us not forget that despite this noticeable shift from Afro-pessimism to Afro-optimism by the global determiners of growth and progress, when it came to the acronyms they invented to describe who was rising, who was growing, who was emerging in the global south, Africa was accorded little or no space. Thus, we got the BRIC countries into which South Africa was admitted as an afterthought, a tag-along to give us BRICS. Started out as BRIC before it became BRICS. And now I hear that we have the mint countries. My own Nigeria thankfully made the cut. I think there has been a deliberate attempt here to put South Africa in BRICS and Nigeria in mint. put them in the same room and their rivalry will bring down the roof. So that's why they are not putting them either in bricks or in mint. They're separating them. There are also the now famous next 11 countries. This time, Egypt makes the cut. In essence, the gale of post-new millennium Afro-optimism from the north will only allow 3 of 54 countries into its nirvana of acronyms. One thing informed these projections into Africa's future. Whether those making such robust projections loudly and latter-day converts to Afro-optimism of the economist or New Bretton Woods variety, or technocrats and development experts speaking in those familiar growth, democracy, and good governance talk shops from Davos to Addis Ababa, from the boardrooms of corporate Africa to the seminar rooms of the continent's universities, we are told that Africa's future is bright because of the boundless energy, genius, and creativity of her youth demographic. And you only need to look across this room to understand that. The oldest continent, the cradle of humanity, we are told, presents the ironic scenario of having the greatest number of young people on earth. This youth demographic is said to be opportunity. All that needs to be done now is for the African state to place the Millennium Development Goals within the reach of this vast youth demographic. Pursue infrastructural renewal and economic growth and expansion. Eradicate the unholy trinity of poverty, ignorance, and disease. Deepen democracy and good governance. And all other things shall be added. Thank you. Going by the tenor and body language of the African Union, that body certainly believes that the path to Africa's future lies somewhere in the philosophy of the development community as I have sketched it out above. I should know. The African Union has been working on a development blueprint for the continent, as some of you here already know. The 50th anniversary of the OAU in 2013 inspired the African Union to try to project into the next 50 years and determine what the continent would or should look like. The AU spent much of 2013 organizing talk shops around the world, from Dakar, all kinds of groups, academics, bureaucrats, just gathered people in little groups to start working on that document. From academia to the corporate world, stakeholders in the future of the African continent were asked to reflect on Africa in the next 50 years. The idea was to eventually produce some kind of Africa 2063 document, a development roadmap for the continent in the next 50 years. I was privileged to be part of that process. Alas, the culmination, but not the origin, of my annoyances in this tedious business of thinking and writing Africa. To draft a 2063 agenda for the entire continent, the AU at some point needed to consult very widely. Inevitably, these consultations involved Africans of the old and the new diaspora. The AU wanted both categories of diaspora Africans to contribute to drafting this all-important document that would have been produced by Africans at home abroad about the future of our beloved continent. Thus it was that in October 2013, I had the extraordinary privilege of being invited to New York by the AU to be part of the Diaspora Consultations meeting on the Africa 2063 agenda of the AU. Our brief during the said meeting in New York was unambiguous. The AU wanted us to project into the future as far ahead as 2063. We've had 50 years of the OAU. Now, what could be the next 50 years? We were to come up with the Africa of our dreams. We were asked specifically to engage the question, what Africa would you love to see in the year 2063? As I contemplated the theme of that meeting in my apartment in Accra, I'm based in Accra now, I'm on sabbatical there, prior to departure for New York, I thought it was dangerous business to gather academics, technocrats, and bureaucrats in New York and ask them to envision Africa 50 years down the road. I thought that the AU was in a way asking us to encroach on the coveted territory of prosperity Pentecostal pastors who have taken over the entire continent and are assuring Africa's 1 billion people that next year and the year after the next, until we get to 2063, shall be the year of their miracle and abundance. My apprehension was further deepened by certain developments. After being told that I would be addressing a plenary session of the New York meeting, and it was going to be a week of meetings, and then there will be plenary sessions and working groups and all that. So I was given a plenary session. So after being told that I will be addressing a plenary session of the New York meeting from the perspectives of culture and identity, some plenary speakers, political economy, well, we'll get into it. I sat on the patio of my residence on the campus of the University of Ghana, a cup of coffee in hand, and tried to start reflecting on the subject that was taking me to New York. However, I had difficulty focusing and concentrating because down the road from me, an open-air campus for Jesus Prosperity Pentecostal Crusade was rounding up a week of intense miracles and testimonies, and the participants in that spiritual revelry were determined that the huge loudspeakers they had deployed for the occasion would cause an earthquake on campus and around Accra. So loud was the noise of the singing, the ministration, and the anointing. As I was blogging about the event on my Facebook wall, the officiating pastor said something I'm sure all of you in this room have heard before. It is something that I have encountered in country after country as I have crisscrossed the African continent in the last 2 decades as a writer and a student of the evolving cultures and identities of the youth of Africa. I think I've been to 40 of those countries now. It is something that has made me arrive at the conclusion that prosperity Pentecostalism, along with its cultures, styles, and modes of social inflection, is the most significant cultural wind blowing across the continent, rivaled perhaps only by the social media revolution. The pastor in Accra asked, you have to understand, it's a huge football field across from my residence. And there were literally thousands, of students there. And I had my coffee, and I'm studying that phenomenon. I'm not studying it as faith. I'm engaging it as a continental cultural force. And in some of my graduate seminars for the Institute of African Studies back in Canada, I actually teach a course entitled The Cultures of Pentecostalism. So you have to understand where I'm coming from. So it's not the faith, it's the culture and how it's shaping identities and imaginaries across the continent. So I'm sitting and observing this phenomenon, preparing to go and discuss culture in New York. The pastor asked his audience to close their eyes. Then he thundered, next year, Forbes magazine will release another list of the wealthiest Africans. If you can see yourself in that list, please stand up and scream for Jesus. You can't make all these things. You can't. And then the screaming. We're talking undergraduate kids here, about 2017, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are going to be in Forbes in 2014. This was October 2013. So you have to understand the power of this cultural phenomenon. We were in October 2013. The image of nearly 1,000 undergraduates of the University of Ghana screaming in Pentecostal jouissance assured that they would appear in the January 2014 edition of Forbes magazine as Africa's newest billionaires is what I took with me the following day to board the Delta Airways flight, which took me to the African Diaspora Consultation Meeting on the Africa 2063 agenda of the AU in New York. On board, I thought about it all. All we need to do to have an idea of Africa in 2063 is listen to the continent's prosperity Pentecostal pastors as they enrapture hundreds of millions of our citizens from Kenya to Zimbabwe, Nigeria to Tanzania, Ghana to Namibia, Congo to Cameroon, Uganda to South Africa. That's one of my country's biggest exports, by the way, outside of Nollywood. And our job in New York would be largely done. Africa in 2063 would be littered with Forbes-rated billionaires flying private jets. Although I would very much have loved to claim all the promises and miracles of prosperity, Pentecostalism for Africa and Africans by the year 2063, I had other agendas in mind as I boarded the plane to New York. I was going to do a plenary on what role culture might play in Africa's march to 2063. I thought that what I witnessed in Accra would be a good entry point for an auspicious discussion of the power, appeal, and relevance of culture to any discussion of Africa's future. Beyond faith, Pentecostalism has morphed into a powerful subculture across the continent, affecting every aspect of life, from governance and democracy to the diction and worldview of a significant proportion of the continent's youth and even politicians. Sometimes you listen to arguments in the Nigerian National Assembly, and people are saying it is well, and people are binding each other, senators and politicians. So it's a language style, the diction, it's a culture. The language of development and post-development, with its long list of sustainable this and that, industry, technology, innovation, economic expansion, and all the usual suspects, presupposes a citizenry ready to travel along those paths under the guidance of a visionary leadership. What happens when a large swath of this citizenry evolves in a subculture of immediate miracles? Can Africa's planners and policymakers afford to ignore these and allied cultural forces now shaping African identities as they project into the future? So I was going to ask some of these questions in New York while you are talking your GDPs, the undergraduates in Ghana. In fact, what one professor told me a story. That's how at the staff club, because to get to the staff club in one of the clubs in Legon, you have to cross that pitch, and every night thousands are there in ministration. And this guy was going to drink beer. This elderly professor was going to have his evening beer, and then he had to cross, and he hears his name. These kids were writing his paper the following morning, and they were binding the spirit of hash marking in him, in their professor. They were coming against and casting out the spirit of hash marking. They were writing his exam the following morning. So he went to drink his beer in anger and graded them very harshly. He had his name. So I thought this was going to be a good seg into my plenary session in New York about culture and the need to deal with these things. You can't deal with it as faith. It's a cultural force. I did not get the chance to make these submissions in New York. Indeed, I had very little time to situate culture as a key plank in the envisioning process being undertaken for the continent. Unlike all the other plenary presenters who were allotted 15 minutes individually for their presentation, these were World Bank types, IMF types, the usual suspects who carry data and statistics in their briefcases and all that. So they got 15 minutes to throw around figures and statistics and GDP and all that. So unlike all those guys who were allotted 15 minutes individually for their presentations, I discovered only at the venue of the event that two of us had been lined up for the segment on culture. So it wasn't going to be, culture wasn't going to be as important as GDP and statistics and data. So the two of us were crammed into one session and we were asked to divide up the 15 minutes, so 7 minutes each to talk about culture. And that's what was going to make it into that Africa 2063 document under the banner of culture. Evidently, the African Union, like the continent's technocrats, bureaucrats, planners, policymakers, and political leaders, is persuaded by the thinking that the hardware language of growth and development, of macro and microeconomics, of cutting-edge technology and industry, of GDP and other dizzy data from the IMF, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and relevant agencies of the UN are more germane to the continent's advancement than the software language of culture. It dawned on me painfully in New York that whenever two or three are gathered in the name of Africa's future, culture is always invited as a sideshow, as entertainment. The development experts and growth and development data wielders in New York would have been content and happy if I had made a presentation on Nollywood as momentary diversion from their very serious business of thinking Africa and her future. For them, GDP, growth, data, development, statistics, and all that jazz were the path to that future. No need to understand the cultures, subcultures, and countercultures informing the imaginaries and identities of that much touted youth democratic, and how such cultures might shape Destination 2063. If I was annoyed by the peripheral space allotted to the possible role of culture in Africa's future and development during the New York sessions, more annoyances awaited me on my return to Accra. This time, the event was a book launch attended by the usual suspects: diplomats, technocrats, bureaucrats, academics, and we had wine, cheese, just like we did here. As it happens, discussions came down to the future prospects of Africa, and all the regular keywords came pouring out from various corners of the room: growth, sustainable development, GDP, good governance, democracy, you know the drill. Does culture have a role to play in any of these scenarios? I asked. I was rudely interrupted by an ambassador of one of the African countries representing one of the African countries in Accra, actually, who told me that we've had enough of this cultural nationalism stuff. What we need now are science, technology, and accelerated development. I looked around the room. The rapid and contented nods of approval I saw made me come to terms with my precarious situation. Mine was not only a minority opinion in that room, folks were impatient with me and my ilk. What do I mean by my ilk? I'm talking about those of us working as writers, creative writers, scholars, and activists in the continent's arts and culture establishment, lone voices screaming in the wilderness, struggling to persuade Africa's technocrats, planners, state officials, and policymakers that they labor in vain if they continue to give short shrift to culture as they map Africa's path to her future and destiny. I'm sure you understand that there were other annoyances before my own recent histories of annoyance at being constantly invited to meetings. I don't even know why I get invited to those meetings. In Europe, all these kind of World Bank, NGO, extra academic stuff. You are always invited to come and give the cultural angle over tea and coffee. But there have been others before me in those scenarios. We were invited to meetings and talk shops in Africa and outside of the continent, where culture is meant to entertain development experts, trafficking all day long in data and statistics funded largely by our friends at Bretton Woods. I'm sure you all remember Ngugi wa Thiong'o and his lifelong frustration and annoyance over the language question in Africa. In fact, just before he left for New York, he was at the University of Ghana giving a keynote at the 50th anniversary of the Institute, where I'm currently domiciled. And it was the same theme about the peripherality of culture through language, African language. His although at the time I thought he was getting boring because I've read him for 30 years, but I knew where he was coming from. So Ngugi and you're familiar with his own case. But we must mention the less familiar case of Chinua Achebe, who also has had something to say about these annoyances. He too was down that road in the 1980s, and he reminds us in his essay, Africa is People. Like my humble self in New York, Chinua Achebe had the misfortune of being among development experts in one of those meetings where Africa is somehow expected to develop outside of our cultures. Let's hear what Achebe has to say in this essay. I'm quoting him now. I believe it was in the first weeks of 1989 that I received an invitation to an anniversary meeting of the 25th year or something like that of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in Paris. I accepted without quite figuring out what I could possibly contribute to such a meeting, celebration. My initial puzzlement continued right into the meeting itself. In fact, it grew as the proceedings got underway. Here was I, an African novelist among predominantly Western bankers and economists, a guest, as it were, from the world's poverty-stricken provinces to a gathering of the rich and powerful in the metropolis. As I listened to them, I was left in no doubt by the assurance they displayed that these were the masters of our world, savoring the benefits of their success. They read and discussed papers on economic development matters in different regions of the world. They talked in particular about the magic bullet of the 1980s structural adjustment, specially designed for those parts of the world where economies had gone haywire. And Achebe goes on in the essay to talk about his frustration at the alienating language of data, statistics, and all that. But I'll skip. Eventually, Chinua Achebe did have his eureka moment. That's that moment when the person who is brought to those meetings understands why he was brought there. Suddenly, I received something like a stab of insight, and it became clear to me why I had been invited, what I was doing there in that strange assembly. I signaled my desire to speak and was given the floor. I told them what I had just recognized. I said that what was going on before me was a fiction workshop no more, no less. Here you are spinning your fine theories to be tried out in your imaginary laboratories. You're developing new drugs and feeding them to a bunch of laboratory guinea pigs and hoping for the best. I have news for you. Africa is not fiction. Africa is people. Real people. Have you thought of that? You brilliant people, world experts. You may even have the very best intentions. But have you really thought of Africa as people? That is, beyond all these statistics and data. So out of annoyance, Ngugi wa Thiong'o screams that Africa is language. Out of annoyance, Chinua Achebe screams that Africa is people, language, people, culture. You begin to wonder why those experts and technocrats who insist that Africa's youth bulge is an opportunity also insist on not seeing the nexus between youth cultures and the future of the continent. You wonder why political leaders across the continent insist on the false dichotomy between science and technology on the one hand, and culture on the other hand. In my own country, Nigeria, for instance, the scramble for science and technology attained such a maddening frenzy, especially in the 80s and 90s, that policies were put in place to discourage arts subjects which came to be seen as obstacles to development. Politicians began to openly denigrate the teaching of African history, cultures, and languages in our schools. This is what renowned Nigerian historian, Professor Toyin Falola, refers to, quote, as the persecution of the arts and humanities in African educational systems by bureaucrats and officials of states keen on the teaching of science and technology and development-oriented subjects. By doing this, the state creates a dichotomy and a false hierarchy between science and technology on the one hand and arts and culture on the other hand. He continues, here comes the bad news for the persecutors. Creating, managing, and solving underdevelopment is a human cultural concern. And this is where the humanities come to the fore as they generate greater imagination, thereby creating more intellectual creativity, encouraging broader reflection on the future of society. End quote. The university in my own part of Africa is of course not left out of this persecution business. If you look at recent vision documents by the University of Ghana, Legon, and the University of Ibadan, those two universities in West Africa, they have some funny documents that they have just produced. Vision documents. You will detect the underhand privileging of certain disciplines in response to the funding priorities of the World Bank. I believe I don't need to tell you which disciplines are being de-emphasized and which ones are being privileged and narrativized as being more germane to Africa's growth and development. The complicity of the African university with this scenario is one frustrating source of annoyance, for this is the site where the critical connections between culture, science, and technology ought to be made. The gown ought to make these connections and persuade the town to see them. I don't know how much of Kwame Nkrumah's great essay, The African Genius, you all remember. Perhaps you've been discussing that essay in this conference. Some of you have been citing it. That essay was the keynote address he delivered at the founding of the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana, on October 25, 1963. While giving the new institute a mandate to tie culture to development and not separate them as is annoyingly done today, Nkrumah indicates that the premium that he and his generation of African leaders placed on culture stems from their understanding of the fact that growth, development, science, and technology all depend on a people's creative genius, which in turn depends on taste. Taste is a function of culture. Taste is a matter of aesthetics. What a people consume and how they consume it depend entirely on their cultural life world. Innovation, science, and technology respond to taste as shaped by culture. Sometimes Westerners, the power of culture, when some people somewhere come and impose sushi on them. Everywhere those kids, I've been in North America now for some 15 years. I taught at Penn State and did my PhD in Canada and back in teaching in Canada now. Sushi on American campuses. That's the power of culture. It means that those Western societies, they're not just imbibing those cultures, but they're building technologies around the consumption of those cultures. Twitter was invented because somebody somewhere understood America's cultural predilection for information that could be packaged and consumed quickly like fast food. Innovations in the automobile industry are entirely driven by years of field surveys into taste as driven by culture. This is the meeting point of technology, development, and culture. Africa's science and technology in the future will be driven by the cultural tastes and predilections of the peoples of Africa. At least it ought to be. If Nkrumah could see these connections in 1963, why have things become so hazy in 2014? If these connections are not being made today, or at least are not being made satisfactorily by the African University, if certain disciplines, I don't know what the situation here is in South Africa, so if my mention of African universities, it's more in reference to West Africa. If certain disciplines and fields are being privileged while others are persecuted, to borrow the word of Tony Falola, in response to the funding stimulus of the World Bank. The World Bank has been very active lately in West Africa, and such other bodies and agencies in the global north. Is there any wiggle room for strategic critique and remedial actions? Is there any agential location from which one could point out the fact that those who pour millions into the preservation of the cultures, tastes, and ways of life of the global north, preserving culture and the arts, funding museums and other locations of culture and memory, classical music, and a lot of funding, now turn around and tell you that your own culture is antithetical to science, technology, and development? What's going on? I ask myself. Why would the same funding body fund a museum in Washington and tell an African university that, that museum in Kwara State in Nigeria, you won't make progress if you are fixated on that past? What's going on? As our friend Benyafanga Wainaina recently puts it, how does one imagine the new or newness in Africa when the very paradigms of imagining are defunded, discouraged, and stigmatized as inimical to progress, growth, and development? The problematic of newness, of imagining the new in Africa, brings us back to the question of the youth bulge and what that demographic phenomenon portends for the future of this continent. As I stated earlier, policymakers, bureaucrats, and experts in the development community bandy data and statistical figures ranging from 60 to 70% youth demographic for many African countries, with youth sometimes defined as persons 30 years old and below. Whichever way one looks at it, the majority of Africa's 1 billion people fall within the youth demographic. Using conventional language and its assorted registers, again, GDP, growth, development agendas, plans, etc., Africa's bureaucrats and development experts pay attention to everything about this particular demographic except for their cultural predilections and predicaments. Yet, we forget that their peers in America have invented Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest in response to specific cultural imperatives and stimuli. We forget that their peers in China, Japan, South Korea, and other parts of Asia are in a daily competition to invent apps informed by the cultural circumstances of those places. In essence, the youth of other continents are meeting the world, unleashing their genius and creativity on the rest of the world from the platform of their respective cultures. On what cultural platform or platforms are the youths of Africa expected to meet the world and compete with their peers when the teaching of African history, cultures, and languages are treated largely as impediments to science and technology disciplines in many an African school system? Lack of sufficient attention to the power of culture can sometimes mean the difference between being the next Mark Zuckerberg or being just another burden of Africa, or burden on Africa, eating grass in automated obedience to the instruction of your pastor while awaiting the immediate miracle of your millions. I'm sure you in South Africa can relate to that phenomenon of grass eating. Something is awfully funny, and I dare not conclude this lecture without mentioning it. Whether we are dealing with politicians, technocrats, or bureaucrats in Africa, those who are loudest in disavowing the organic linkages between culture and science and technology, those who file criminal charges against culture, accusing her of being an enemy of progress and an obstacle to sustainable development, are the first to run for cover under the umbrella of culture the moment their comfortable prejudices and positions are threatened. Think of the anti-gay legislations in Nigeria and Uganda and how the politics of it all has played out as a cultural war between Africa and the West. All of a sudden, those who would have Africa shake off the shackles of culture and backwardness in order to embrace progress, science, and technology became custodians of our culture. They spoke authoritatively in the name of culture, defined it, protected it, determined what it must include and exclude, and framed Africa as a puritanical cultural entity in opposition to the corroding influences of the West. Culture was suddenly back in business, big business. Beyond prejudice, beyond the tragedy of the politics of exclusion on account of a person's sexual orientation, there is a crucial point that has been overlooked in the back and forth between the protagonists and the antagonists of the gay laws in Nigeria and Uganda. Through slavery, through colonialism, through every manner of historical tragedy, the humanity of the African was questioned on the basis of his culture. The responses to these historical tragedies, negritude, cultural nationalism, etc., were mostly gestures of cultural affirmation. Today, the gay controversy around the continent reminds us that culture is still the site where Africa is being asked to provide evidence of her membership of the human family. Culture is also the site where Africa is pushing back, claiming rightly or wrongly to be resisting foreign cultural imposition. In other words, no matter where you stand, it's still all about culture. You're framing your argument, whether you're condemning it or you're supporting it, you are framing it not in terms of now suddenly culture is no longer backwards. So, it's this something that's so important. It's you, it's us. This is who we are. As 2014 came upon us, many technocrats and development experts across Africa momentarily dropped their GDPs, their data, their statistics, their micro and macroeconomic indicators, hoisted culture on their heads, and went to war against the West in the name of culture. When push came to shove with the gay issue. Now, ain't it amazing, as Don Williams put it? I'm sure you know that song. Ain't it amazing when miracles happen?